Hello again, welcome back. I'm Scully, picking up again in the instruction manual as it is written in the Cosmos in section B of chapter 3, How Electric Charges Are Caused. The concepts of positive and negative charge are so familiar to us, and the functions of nature that they aim to describe are so present and in our lives that it is easy to conclude that there are such things as a positive and negative charge. Models using these terms to explain observations are very successful in describing what we see happening. What they are not successful at, however, is explaining why these charges exist in the first place. We do not call a planet or a star negative or positive. Why then do we conclude charged particles to be so different? This way of describing what is actually occurring is an approximation. They are not different. The underlying processes causing particles to behave in this manner are even simpler and have nothing to do with charge. The simplest examples are of a positively charged particle and a negatively charged particle, as shown in figure 17. For a positively charged particle, the electric fields specifically are outward, while for a negatively charged particle, the electric fields specifically point inward. For a neutral charge, no such field is present. The question is, why? When we assume that charge actually exists, then the answer goes no further. It is in their nature. However, this does not truly answer the question of why this happens. The critical element is that charged particles are out of balance with their environment. Only when there is an imbalance is there a charge perceivable. Otherwise, the system is seen as neutral. Balance is equilibrium. On Earth, when our surroundings are in equilibrium, we have calm and peaceful weather. When there is an imbalance, we have high pressure or low pressure storm systems develop. What is most telling is how these systems form and interact. A high pressure system, due to it being above equilibrium with its environment, pushes outward on the lower pressure environment surrounding it. Inversely, low pressure systems, due to being below equilibrium with their environment, have particles pushed from the surrounding high pressure environment inward, as shown in figure 18. Simply put, what this tells us is that positively charged particles are high pressure systems relative to their environment with higher outflows than inflows, and negatively charged particles are low pressure systems relative to their environment with higher inflows than outflows. In a storm's case on Earth, this pressure is of the air. In the case of a charged particle, this pressure is ethereal, the result of a particle either radiating more mass than it receives from its local environment or less. In both instances, the particles are out of balance with equilibrium and therefore exhibit traits of functioning in a way that brings equilibrium. This is why like charges repel, because out of balance systems tend towards equilibrium, not further imbalance. Two proximal high pressure systems will generally push outward and against one another and thereby separate towards the lower pressure surroundings. Two proximal low pressure systems move towards the balance of the higher pressure surroundings rather than the further imbalance of the nearby low pressure system, causing repulsion. In the case where a high pressure zone and a low pressure zone become sufficiently proximal, the particles of the high pressure zone are more easily able to flow into the area of the low pressure zone than other relatively higher pressure surroundings, and thereby they can merge together to bring the two systems to equilibrium, balance, and neutrality. Therefore, The most complete way to describe a positive charge is as a high pressure system, and a negative charge is as a low pressure system, respectively. This allows us to see beyond charge to the actual mechanism behind the apparent charge characteristic. This additionally explains why plasma, which is a free proton without any electrons, is stable. As a proton, we generally see it as a positive charge, meaning it is a high pressure system. However, plasma exists at extremely high temperatures, such as found on the sun. Only in the environment where the temperature is so high that what we normally see around us in our environment as a positive charge, a high pressure system, becomes neutral. This is because temperature is not some abstract characteristic of a system, but rather it is a tangible measurement of the density of infinitesimal particles filling a given volume. If something is low temperature and becomes heated, there is a physical flow of infinitesimal particles that actively fill the volume of the object being heated. If the object is hotter than its environment, then these particles act in the same manner as charged particles, where the volume of the hot object is high pressure relative to its environment. This causes physical flow of particles from the object to the cooler environment until there is a balance between the pressure of these particles inside and outside of the object, such as in the case of an object at room temperature. In the case of plasma, the physical presence of infinitesimal particles that fill the environment around the quote proton causes the proton's environment to become higher in pressure, as a positive charge is simply high pressure relative to its environment. In a plasma, the temperature is sufficient so that the environment's pressure is equivalent to the pressure of the proton. Thereby, it does not need an electron for equilibrium because it is at equilibrium. It is in balance with its environment and therefore it is stable. Section C of Chapter 3, Infinity Unbounded. The capacity of an infinite model to provide physical explanations for phenomena indicates that the universe is infinite. In fact, if we were to try to define infinity ourselves using words, we would fall short. The only way that we can define infinity is by pointing to the universe. It is more than a word, more than a number, more than anything. It is literally what the universe is. They are one and the same. It comprises all thoughts, ideas, people, places, plants, animals, sciences, religions, world's perspectives, time, and all other things. Nothing is outside of infinity. As has been discussed, all things function the same. The infinite array of differing particles of the universe make up layer after layer built of larger and smaller particles, all of which can be the largest building blocks which an observer is composed of, sharing the volume of space. These each are different dimensions within the single universe. In this way, though there is nothing outside of the universe, there are infinite planes of existence within the universe. Thereby, a single universe is capable of having infinite dimensions physically. This can be visually represented as in Figure 19. So we happen to be composed of atoms, so we see our adjacent levels using these atoms, and so that makes us see Earth as Earth, stars as stars, electrons as electrons. But if we had any other building block, the adjacent levels to that building block would be seen exactly the same. We would see the building block as our atoms. We would see larger building blocks as planets, stars, black holes, smaller as electrons, subatomic particles, light, And so, regardless of where the observer is within the infinite array of particles, they still see the same way as we do. An observer composed of varied building blocks from our own would perceive their adjacent levels as we see ours, and the rate at which time passes as we do. This is because their building blocks act as clocks which dictate the passage of perceived time. This can be envisioned by the clock-like nature of orbits such as electrons and planets. However, the total passage of time in an absolute sense would greatly vary. If their building block were larger than ours, then our entire eternity could pass in a blink of their eye. Inversely, within layer upon layer of smaller particles around us, eternity passes every instant. The largest systems are frozen in time, and the smallest race through time so fast that eternity passes. This sheds light onto the nature of time and of reality by stretching it to its very limits. It means that within no time, eternity exists. Similarly, it means that within no thing, everything exists. Section D, Mirrors of Infinity. There are but two things, all that is and all that isn't. All that is composed of everything, infinity. All that isn't is composed of everything else, nothing. The universe is a balance between infinity and nothing. This is because they are equals, in perfect balance. Mathematically speaking, quite literally, 0 equals infinity. And yet, while they are equals, they are also opposites. Nothing is the lack of everything. 0 is the penultimate low-pressure system, the perfect vacuum, and infinity is its opposite high-pressure system. From this balance and imbalance, everything that we see arises. From the equivalence, the universe always exists in balance, and from the opposition, flow arises. The passage of time and all the change we see comes due to this flow from infinity to 0. It is noted here that this simultaneous balance and opposition between 0 and infinity gives rise to Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. What happens when the flow reaches 0? As infinity and 0 are equals, the flow goes both ways. From 0 to infinity, this flow looks to us as if it is going backwards. This is because simultaneously, 0 is infinity and infinity is 0, while both being opposites in each instance. This mirror half of the universe where 0 and infinity are effectively switched is observable. This is not some abstraction, but rather is rooted in tangible and real observations. A vacuum functions identically but opposite in time to a star. It absorbs large systems, breaking them down into smaller constituents, and acts as a low-pressure system. When time flows in the opposite direction, a vacuum becomes a star. The process is reversed, where it takes smaller systems and combines them into larger and radiates them outward, and functionally is a high-pressure system. In precisely the same way, when the passage of time for an observer is seen in the opposite direction as our own, they still experience reality in the same way as we do. The difference is that what we see as planets, stars, galaxies, and every other system, they see as vacuum equivalents. And what we see as vacuums in space, all having varying sizes and strengths, they see as radiant bodies in the cosmos. This is because as the flow from infinity to 0 occurs in one half, The flow backwards is happening in the other half. Infinity is zero, and zero is infinity, which for a particular observer is a matter of perception. This leads to what is known as antimatter. Just as in a wave, there is a portion above the center point and an equal but opposite portion below the center point, so too does matter and antimatter function. The balance between zero and infinity exists between them, and for every portion above the balance, there is an equal and opposite portion below the balance, like +3 and -3, +10 and -10, whatever it may be. For an observer, they can see both things. They are equals and yet opposites. In this case, what we call matter comprises the portions above the balance point between infinity and zero in our perception. What we call antimatter is that which exists below the balance point. These systems can be and are as large as their equivalent matter, other half. They can approach infinity in mass and yet be opposites. Rather than being observed as massive stars, they are observed as massive vacuums. When the direction of time is reversed, it is akin to switching the signs so that +3 becomes -3 and -3 becomes +3. In other words, reversing time so massive stars become massive vacuums and massive vacuums become massive stars. Just as infinity and zero are one and the same and yet opposites, so too are antimatter and matter one and the same and yet opposites due to this vacuum-star relationship. They even are exemplary representations of the equivalence and opposition of infinity and zero. Richard Feynman in QED, The Strange Theory of Light and Matter, discusses this interaction. He states, the path of a backward moving electron can be so long to appear real in an actual physical experiment in the laboratory. The backwards moving electron, when viewed with time moving forwards, appears the same as an ordinary electron, except it's attracted to normal electrons. We say it has a positive charge. For this reason, it's called a positron. The positron is a sister particle to the electron and is an example of an antiparticle. This phenomenon is general. Every particle in nature has an amplitude to move backwards in time and therefore has an antiparticle. Just as zero and infinity are opposites, which are separate from one another, so too are matter and antimatter. These do not coexist in the same space because they become separate and yet reversibly interchangeable. Vacuum particles exist generally in vacuums, and when they form in an area of ordinary matter, they cancel and bring balance in what is known as annihilation, akin to +3 and -3 combining to form zero, the baseline. In the case of antimatter and matter annihilation, two similar value systems combine and balance is achieved. This causes areas that are high in one or the other to exist. Areas where antimatter is most prevalent are the vacuums of space. There, if matter ventures, it can be stripped apart and dissolved to feed the vacuum. In the same way as antimatter cannot calmly coexist without reaction around mostly matter, nor can matter calmly exist without reaction around mostly antimatter. And yet, in a reversed frame of reference, that vacuum which is stripping matter apart that enters it becomes a star which is merging matter and radiating it. In destruction, there is equal and opposite creation. To this extent even do Newton's laws apply. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. As mentioned, antimatter has an equal but opposite charge. Referring to the relationship of pressure to charge, this can be understood with reference to a balance point. Above the balance exists matter, and below exists antimatter. A simple number line can illustrate why we see the charges flip for antimatter. So let us look at one in figure 20. So we just got a number line from negative 10 to 10 here, just for as an example. If we picture in this number line that 0 is the balance between two equals and opposites, then let us envision each number to represent an absolute mass value and the sign to represent matter as positive and antimatter as negative. A high mass matter object, let's say 10, will emit more radiation to its environment than its environment feeds it, and so the highest pressure on this particular line is at 10. As we move downward, pressure gets lower and lower. Once we pass the balance point of 0, the pressure continues to get lower. This is where vacuum particles of antimatter exist. As a result of this, a higher mass vacuum particle, such as -10, is low in pressure. This means that it behaves like a negative charge, while the lower mass vacuum particle behaves like a positive charge. We have been forced to ask the question, where has all the antimatter gone? This is because we do not see much of it around, which is because antimatter mostly exists specifically within the vacuums of space, for it is the vacuums of space. Within each mirror half of the universe, individual systems ebb and flow between growth and decay. They move through environments, growing until they enter an environment where they receive less radiation than they emit. This causes them to decay back towards equilibrium. As environment changes, equilibrium with it also changes. Generally speaking, this produces a wave-like nature of flow across time. If a system is growing, such a system receives more energy from its environment than it releases to its environment. Importantly, energy is synonymous with mass. Simply put, for m equals 0 approaching infinity, mass in is greater than mass out. This just means that as a mass m grows, it does so because it receives more mass in than it radiates out. Here, 0 and infinity are relative and can be used to represent any low and high points in growth of a mass, and not necessarily just the two absolute endpoints. As the system grows, however, if the environment remains somewhat constant, then it becomes more at equilibrium with its environment, causing its rate of growth to slow down until it reaches equilibrium and it stops growing. In other words, for m equals infinity, mass in equals mass out. When its growth stops, it releases equivalent radiation to the mass it receives from the environment. If the environment changes, then this balance will change. If it moves to a higher energy environment, it will repeat the first step of growth. When the system moves to a lower energy environment, then it will begin to release more radiation than it receives. For m going from infinity to 0, mass in is less than mass out. It then shrinks back towards 0, where it once more approaches equilibrium with its environment. This causes the rate of energy loss to slow down until it stabilizes. For m equals 0, mass in equals mass out. From there, it then awaits an environmental change to grow or decay further once more. Over and over, this dance between all that is and all that isn't continues. At all points, a system can always grow larger or shrink further, representative of the infinite nature of reality. As a function of time, this system's mass can be generally plotted as shown in figure 21 below. If this looks familiar, it is because the universe is built on this simple principle. It is from this perfect dance between all that is and all that isn't that all that we see arises. So we just got basically a sine wave with a peak at infinity and a second trough at 0 to indicate just the flow between these two extremes, which are again equals and opposites. And from their equal yet opposite nature, all that we see arises. And so that's really going back to the cover. So that's why the cover has this image, is because they are equals and opposites, and they give rise to one another. They are mirrors of one another. They are reflections of one another. All right, so that's the end of chapter 3. The next chapter is chapter 4, the not so fundamental forces. So I'll get to that in the next video. Thanks for stopping by. Alrighty.